In this video, we are going to look at the forgotten football kit brands. Nowadays, the market is dominated by Adidas, Nike, and then a mixture of the rest. However, there was a day where companies like Kappa, Diadora, Umbro, and Reebok ruled the shirt world. So, let's start with Kappa, because Kappa were massive in the 90s. Founded in 1978, they went on to build a respected name for themselves in European football. Kappa had teams like Juventus, Barcelona, Porto. They also made the Italian national team shirts and so much more. But to me, some of the best work Kappa used to do were their pre-game jackets. I'll just show a few examples, but the Barcelona tracksuit, this iconic photo, the Italian tracksuit, they were the best in this regard, and I think this has helped them in the modern age because people look at it with so much nostalgia, and there was just so much style back then. So if they were so good, then what happened? And in my opinion, it was partially due to the fact that they didn't really have a booming football boot market. All the big companies like Nike, Adidas and Puma, and you'll be hearing a lot of their names throughout this video, they all have essentially two sets of revenue within the football world. Other than just normal merchandise, they have football boots and they have football shirts. And Kappa did make some football boots, they had the combats. However, they just didn't have the star power. And like I say, I'll say it all over again as I did in the last video, even Umbro had Alan Shearer and Michael Owen in the 90s. Kappa didn't have anyone for a long period of time. And I think one of the big issues, I definitely couldn't find anyone outside of Italy, because I think they were such an Italian brand that they struggled to really break out. So it's going to be a common theme in this video that Nike and Adidas just did have a huge marketing budget that people like Kappa, they just couldn't compete with. They couldn't get the Zidans of the world, the Ronaldinhos, the David Beckhams to wear those Kappa boots, and therefore their identity and just the brand exposure wasn't as high as these other companies. And in the 2000s, they were ushered out more and more because Nike took over the Juventus and the Barcelona shirts, they lost the contracts with the Roma shirts, and in the 2010s, they started to invest in the smaller or mid-table teams. They did take over the Leeds United kits in 2015 and sold them all the way up into making it to the Premier League. They were the Napoli kit manufacturers from 2015 to 2021. I think the issue is with modern Kappa shirts, they weren't stylish. You saw the Leeds shirts and the Napoli shirts in the mid-2010s. I'm not going to get into it again, but they were skin tight. They weren't cool to look at. I mean, you just have to compare the Leeds shirts under Adidas compared to Kappa. So they've slowly clawed the way back into a bit of a conversation. They're nowhere near Nike and Adidas and Puma. However, they do have some decent teams. They had Fiorentina up until next season, I believe. And also because of retro shirts becoming a huge market nowadays, there are so many nice Kappa retro shirts, which just keeps them relevant. And they also have been the sponsors of Serie B for a while, so they sponsor the ball in that league. So I'd argue in Italy they have a lot more of a relevance than they do in the rest of the other countries. A company that doesn't have much of a relevance anymore is Diadora. What happened to Diadora? I mean, do they still exist? Well, yes, they still do exist, but they are a shadow of the former self. We have to realise the scale of it in the 80s and 90s. Marco van Basten was the face of Diadora in the late 80s. The guy won 3 Ballon d'Ors. He's arguably one of, if not in his prime, the best striker to ever grace the game. And he was the face of the company. And then after he retired, then players like Roberto Baggio became the face of the company, another Ballon d'Or winner. And if 2 weren't enough for you, then I'll throw you George Weah as well, who also wore Diadora boots. And Roy Keane as well. So huge names were sporting their clothing. But to go into football shirts, they really started to enter the conversation in the 90s. Prior to that, Diadora was mainly a tennis company sponsoring, huge players like Bjorn Borg. But it was in the 90s where Italy started wearing that logo. They had some iconic Diadora shirts in the 88 Euros where Italy made it to the semi-final, Italia 90, just an iconic moment for, well, not just Italian football, just football in general. And then the famous World Cup final where Roberto Baggio missed the penalty against Brazil, Italy were wearing Diadora shirts. But it was in the domestic league where they were most prolific, as you saw teams like Roma, and then finally they broke into English football. I mean, we're talking about teams like Aston Villa and Leeds United. They also featured on teams like Watford, Sheffield Wednesday, but they never really broke through to one of the major teams. Despite Nike and Adidas just being huge players in the 2000s, I think you can say it is the most competitive era for kit manufacturers in the Premier League. This is because the league had become so big worldwide that every company wanted a slice. And unfortunately, unless you were going to blow your entire budget, you weren't going to get a Liverpool, a Chelsea, a Man United, and then some of the smaller teams. And sadly for Diadora in the 2010s, they just couldn't keep up. They briefly had Roma again in the 2000s, which are some unreal retro kits, but they didn't carry the momentum into the next decade. Spain, Germany, France, they never really took to having Diadora kits. From what I can see, the main leagues were just England and Italy. And when they lost Leeds, Villa, Roma, Watford, they just couldn't compete financially with Nike, Adidas and Puma. As well, in 2009 they were taken over by the Geox Group, who apparently wanted to focus more on shoes and casual wears and not so much football kits. So similar to Kappa, they have a cult following due to all of their retro kits from the 90s and the 2000s. And also because you have such a high profile player, a player who I think has aged very well with the new generations in Roberto Baggio, there'll always be a bit of a love for Diadora. However, nowadays, they're a bit of a ghost who only produce really South American and lower tier European kits from what I can find. A kit brand that you might not be familiar with if you are a bit younger is Lecoq Sportif. And please in the comments correct me if I'm getting that wrong. But I'd just like to ask quickly if anyone grew up in the 80s or the 90s. They were a huge brand, right? Because I grew up with them maybe in the 2000s a bit. I saw teams like Everton wear the shirt, and it did feel like they were fairly big, and then it just felt like they vanished. Well, they were founded in 1882. The French brand became a major kit supplier though in the 70s and 80s. They had the French national team during the late 60s and early 70s. However, you have to say the most prominent period was the 1980s, where not only did Aston Villa lift the European Cup wearing their kits, but the big one is maybe the most iconic World Cup win in history was in a Lecoq Sportif kit. And that was with Diego Maradona and Argentina in 1986. I mean, you tell me, I just always see Argentina with Adidas. I never see them with another brand, so it's quite interesting when LCS, I'm going to call them LCS to save us all some time, they made their kits in the 80s. I mean, if you don't remember, or if you don't want to remember, this was the Hand of God tournament, and also the goal that no England fan remembers in that game, where he took on half the team, and it was one of the best goals in football history. So again, they were a huge player. Spurs in the 80s, they won the FA Cup. Chelsea for a brief period of time. Title winning Everton side, they were wearing LCS. And they made cool shirts. I mean, I really like the 1984 Spurs kit. But again, what happened? Well, from what I've read, this is more of an interesting story, and it's more cold-blooded by Adidas. Adidas and LCS had a huge legal battle in the 70s regarding Adidas's free stripes in France. It nearly bankrupted LCS. However, they did win the legal battle and the ownership of those free stripes. Adidas did go on to buy 49% of the company, whilst the French government urged businessman André Gelfi to buy the majority. But with Adidas having a controlling stake in LCS in the 80s and 90s, apparently it's widely believed that Adidas just tried to push them out of the market. They tried to limit the distribution because they saw them essentially as a competitor. So after Alex's little quick history lesson, let's move on to the modern age. Well, in the 90s they had lower league teams in England, so it was nothing like the 80s. In the 2000s they had Man City, right up until the takeover, and Everton, but it was only gonna go one way. They recovered slightly in the 2010s, acquiring the Fiorentina kit for 5 years. However, they just couldn't compete. It's a tale as old as time. Adidas, Nike, and kind of Puma, they just battered all these companies out the market. I mean, at the end of the day, LCS, they had huge ties with the Tour de France and tennis over the years. And they also supplied, in 2024, the kits to the Olympic team and the Paralympic team in France. However, saying that, apparently in 2024, they were sued by the French Rugby Federation for an unpaid sponsorship deal. We're going to finish on one that is near and dear to people's hearts in the UK and probably America as well, and that is Reebok. Again, what happened to Reebok? They were huge. They had a football ground named after them. The Bolton Company were founded in 1958, mainly took off in the 80s due to the American expansion. They capitalised on the Premier League's growth when they took over Liverpool in the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. I mean, you got to think about it. Steven Gerrard lifted the Champions League trophy in Istanbul wearing a Reebok shirt. I mean, how crazy does that sound now? They also famously had a partnership with Bolton from 1993 to 2012. And if you're not from the UK or didn't grow up in the 2000s in English football, Bolton and Reebok, they were kind of the same thing for a while. I mean, the stadium that opened in the late 90s was literally called the Reebok Stadium. They had a shirt sponsor, Reebok. Everything was just Reebok with Bolton. Quickly, just aside from football, Shaquille O'Neal wore Reeboks for most of his career, We might not appreciate in England how big, I mean physically and just in the media, Shaq is over here. I mean, I'm literally wearing one of his shirts, but in America he's absolutely huge. But then in a story that is older, I mean, I've said it in this video about a billion times, Adidas bought them in the mid-2000s for about $3.8 billion. Adidas took the contract of NBA jerseys over from Reebok, but more importantly, they started to phase out Reebok's influence within football. From 2014 to 2023, you tell me if I'm wrong, I can't find a Reebok kit, like at all. Recently, I believe Botafogo get them made by Reebok, which is quite interesting because they're doing really well in their league and they played in the Club World Cup, but also Charlton, they're having it next season from what I can tell. And you have to think Reebok did make some decent football boots in the 90s. They had players like Ryan Giggs wear them. However, I just don't think they adapted. I don't think they adapted to the times, the more modern creativity, and also, like I say, Adidas pushed them further and further away from football. Apparently football operations were actually stopped in 2011 for Reebok, and they lost all ties with their major footballers. No player wears Reebok boots nowadays. I dare you to find one, because I have done a decent amount of research for this video and I could not find one. I mean, we have to remember, at one point in the 2000s, they had Liverpool, they had Sporting Lisbon, Atletico Madrid, Besiktas. They had a decent roster of clubs under them, but now they're an absolute shadow of the former selves. And it just shows that when Adidas or Nike do want someone out of the market, they have the power to do so. I don't believe it was mainly to remove them as a football competitor in the UK. I think it was to get their distribution and just their brand in North America, really. But I think subsequently Adidas just went, we'll take over your football operations here. And they have done, they've dominated ever since. They were actually sold in 2022 for around $2.5 billion to multiple private equity companies. So Umbro are still a big brand, they were bought for a lot of money very recently. However, in football they are not a player anymore at all. But let me know what you think of these brands. I didn't go through Umbro because I went through them in a previous video, but there's so many more brands that we just forget about. Nostalgia wise, they are still relevant because they have so many cool shirts from the 80s and 90s. But if you're talking about competitive players in the football market nowadays, Castore, Hummel, all of these shirts have taken over from where these companies were. And of course Nike, Adidas and Puma just dominate the market. But like I say, leave a comment below, tell me what you think, leave a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel. But thanks for watching.